Good morning and welcome to our webinar and roundtable discussion, Serving the Needs of New Arrivals, Undocumented and Refugee Children in New Haven. I am Edwin Colon, an attorney at the Center for Children's Advocacy Teen Legal Advocacy Project. It is a great morning here across from New Haven Green. We've been very fortunate to use the space at Spanish on the Green, and we want to thank Natalia Xiomara Chieffo for allowing us to use her office space. With me this morning is my esteemed colleague, Alice Rosenthal, an attorney with the Medical Legal Partnership Project at Yale New Haven Hospital. Also with us is an incredibly talented and diverse group of panelists who will take part in the roundtable discussion scheduled for later on this morning. For the sake of those of you who are participating in the webinar, will allow them to introduce themselves so you can familiarize the voice with the faces that are on the screen before you. So I'll pass it on to our panelists so that they can start their introductions.
Hi, I'm Kim Jewers-Daly. I'm from Clifford Beers Clinic, and I manage our New Haven Trauma Coalition as well as our school-based services. So we're connected with several schools in New Haven. And why I'm here today is, of course, that we know that trauma is a big experience in regards to undocumented and refugee children as well as their families. And as many kids do show up to school, we know that many families do not. And so Clifford Beers is really committed with the New Haven Trauma Coalition as well to really bring services to the families, not always have them, have to come to our doorstep. So that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Caprice Taylor Mendez. I'm Strategic Program Manager at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and I have the privilege of working with many of these lovely people around the table. And the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven has a commitment in supporting nonprofits and groups that support immigrant rights. And we're also having the privilege of being part of a statewide collaborative of funders that have come together across the state of Connecticut to want to pool together our resources and encourage lifting the voices of those who are doing the work to look at how we can move forward, not just obtaining greater resources in support of immigrants, but as well as continuing supporting them in their policies.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tanya Kimball-Gunn. I work for IRIS, Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. The mission of IRIS is to help refugees and other displaced people establish new lives, regain hope, and contribute to the vitality of Connecticut's communities. I've been with IRIS for 5 years. I'm the manager of youth services. IRIS welcomes about 400 individuals every year. Half of those are children. And as the manager of youth services, I'm responsible for helping families register their children for school. I advocate for families within the school system and help connect individuals in the school system with families.
I want to thank everyone for taking time of your busy schedules, and we have a great panel, and want to say that this has been really a privilege to I know many of you and work with you in the past, so I look forward to our discussion later this morning. Just some housekeeping issues. On the screen you have some information regarding if you have any technical issues with the webinar, please email us or call us during the webinar so we can address any issues. To hear the audio, please again use your computer speakers, and if you can mute your audio, that will be really helpful. Thank you. Any questions during the webinar or comments can be directed to Daniela Aguila at kidscouncil.org, and we will provide you a copy of the PowerPoint and any handouts immediately after the webinar concludes. We'll email that to you. So this is what we were hoping we'll cover this morning, or we're hoping to cover this morning. We'll have two parts of this webinar. The first one will be talking about some legal advocacy strategies to access education, health, and mental health services. And the sub-part of that will be parsing out some education issues pertaining to English language learners, students with interrupted formal education, special education, and college benefits. And then my dear colleague, Alice Rosenthal, will talk about access to health and mental health services in terms of access to state and federal benefits and pro bono or in-kind services, which is very limited. The second part will be the round panel discussion, and really the purpose of the discussion is to talk about common experiences that indicate any systemic problems related to access issues for immigrant and refugee children and their families, and also identify potential advocacy strategies to address those systemic problems. So let's get right into the presentation. Why did we think about just narrowing it to these three main concerns? In our experience, in terms of our practice in our office, well, we see we certainly provide legal advocacy for kids in terms of children who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned. And the experience of many of the kids that we represent is that they've also have many unmet education, health, and mental health needs along the way. And that's what we were hoping we can talk about this morning, how to address those needs with the limited resources that may be available to meet those needs. I thought it would be important to start with some definitions, and again, this is not necessarily the best definition, but it's one way to describe who is it that we're describing, who is it that we're talking about this morning. So we undocumented children, it's a foreign-born person who lacks a right to be in the United States because they've entered without inspection and have not obtained a right to remain, or have stayed beyond the expiration date of a visa or other status. These are some numbers, and I want to sort of point to the top of the screen. This comes from the Migration Policy Institute. They've actually, it's a think tank out of Washington, D.C., and they're quite reputable. They have put together some numbers from analyzing the U.S. Census data. And in terms of unauthorized population in the state, it's estimated that about 108,000 people in the state are undocumented. Of that number, about 7,000 are reported to be under the age of 18. There's also the issue of unaccompanied immigrant children. This is, I think many of you obviously are very familiar with, and it's particularly in the summer of 2014, there was a lot of media attention to the number of kids that were coming from Central America unaccompanied. Over 800 kids have been released by the Office of Refugee Resettlement to live in Connecticut with a family member or someone that can take care of them while they await immigration proceedings. And so that is a significant number as well. In terms of definition for refugee children, this comes from the Convention relating to the status of refugees. Two things: someone who is outside of his or her country of nationality or habitual residence and is unable or unwilling to return due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on his or her race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. And these are some numbers as well regarding the refugee population in Connecticut. About 3,000 refugees from across the world have settled in Connecticut since 2010. This comes from the Refugee Processing Center of the U.S. State Department. And you can see the numbers on top in terms of countries. And it seems that the country with the highest number of refugees that have resettled in Connecticut is Iraq. So we're going to talk about a couple of things in terms of rights of undocumented and refugee children. They have the right to a free public education, and we're going to sort of unpack that a little bit, and some college benefits. So we'll talk about those in the next few slides. First, I want to share with you a little bit about enrollment, and again, this comes from the Migration Policy Institute. About 9,000 children from the ages of 3 to 17 who are undocumented will be eligible to enroll in school, but only 8,000 are enrolled. It's still a high percentage of students enrolled. About 90% of the kids get enrolled in school.
Let's dial in for
the right to a free public education has been decided in a Supreme Court case in 1982 called Pyler versus Doe, and it's basically the notion that all children and youth between the ages of 5 and 21 who have not received a high school diploma have a right to attend the district where they reside. However, this has been interpreted in later decisions. In 1983, a decision has indicated that its school district may require students or their parents to provide proof of residency within the district. It is, however, unlawful to inquire into a student's citizenship or immigration status or that of their parents or guardians because that is not relevant to establishing residency within a district. I want to just caution you that we've actually managed some cases in our practice where the student inadvertently or perhaps because they're not aware of this very discrete statute in federal statute do provide a copy of their visitor's visa, their B1, B2 visa to the school district as a form of identification, and the school district has denied them accommodations. We've seen that in a couple of school districts in Connecticut. And the statute is a statute that
enter your access code followed by the pound or hash sign.
2B7 is really the penalty is really on the student.
To enable audio control, please enter your audio PIN followed by the pound or hash sign. If you do not have a PIN,
potentially lose their visa status as a visitor visa. However, as a prohibition in enrollment, and that is a incorrect interpretation of the statute. So if you hear of these cases, we do want to hear about them. Please call our office so we can address those cases when they come up. So what we want to do over the next couple of slides is just to come up with a framework to figure out the issues of kids who interrupt their formal education, and we'll define what that is in a couple of minutes. Who have English language learning needs and require special education. Students with interrupted learning ELL needs and special education are at a higher risk for dropping out due to stress, literacy, and academic gaps, which lead to high levels of frustration and feeling defeated. So think of this is that concentric figure on top of the slide. Think of the perfect storm. If someone has all three or may have all three issues happening at once, school districts will usually spin their wheels trying to figure out what is really happening. What is sort of the chicken or the egg question? What is causing this student not to learn? What is really going on? Is it because they did not attend school for a number of years in their country of origin? Is it because they're learning a new language? Is it because they have a bona fide disability that prevents them from learning? And so what we're going to try to do is figure out first what are definitions for meeting criteria for eligibility for all three services, and then sort of figuring out some legal strategies in addressing those questions that come up during. Students with interformal education, this is not defined in the statutes. This is not something you'll find in the statutes. But some definitions, and this is a great resource, it's Colorín Colorado, which is an ELL think tank website, provides a lot of resource information on this issue. These are newcomers with 2 or more years of education, interrupted learning in their native country, or who have attended school in the U.S., returned to their native country for a period of time, and then return to the U.S. again. So this is what we call circular migration, right? Someone moves between the United States back to their country of origin, and then return back to the United States, or they can move from one state to another, right, or one city to another, and there will be some gaps in their education. Maybe they've attended kindergarten in English, maybe in terms of their second language, first and second grade in their first language, and then jump back into their second language and third. Again, these are sort of some of the examples that describe the back and forth that some of our kids experience. It's not just an absence of education, but also the sort of going back and forth in terms of their learning. I think most of us are familiarized with English language learners. Schools have an obligation to identify kids who may have English language learning needs. And they do this by doing conducting a home language survey at the beginning of every academic year. They have to test kids who, and so the survey goes out, and one of the questions is, what is the primary language spoken at home? And then if this sort of creates a presumption that the child may have a particularized language learning need, they have to test that child using something, the test called the Language Acquisition Skills Survey. They also, school districts have the obligation to inform parents in their native language. This is when notices go out to the home. If they know that the family speaks a particular language, they should be able, or they should, on their federal law, they should make that communication available in their native language. Provide ESL or bilingual education, and we'll describe the difference between the two, and evaluate the child's progress as they're getting services, ELL services. These are some numbers in terms of undocumented children in terms of English proficiency, and it's a sort of interesting number, right? About 42% of the kids do not speak English, very well, or don't speak English at all, right? So that's very telling. That's sort of the top 5 languages spoken at home. Spanish, it's prominent, but about 61% of the children in this slide. You can also get more specific data for cities and towns if you go to the Connecticut State Department of Education and you look at the strategic school profiles. So there's some really great data that you can find on the State Department of Education website. And I was hoping to get some for New Haven, but I thought it will be a lot of numbers for one presentation. The data for refugee children, this is national data. This is the top 10 languages that, in terms of kids coming into the country. One thing that may jump at you is that we may assume that Spanish will be the top language that refugees speak, or the refugee population may speak when they come, but it's not, right? So it's Arabic, right? And then Spanish falls right somewhere in the middle, right? So it tells you a little bit about the refugee population. Who are the people who, in terms of demographics, who are the people who are coming in as refugees? So English language services, it's usually provided in 2 ways. One, and again, some people even argue 3 different ways, but we'll focus on the 2 that traditionally are offered in our school districts. One is sort of a notion of English as second language, certified teachers who are trained to teach English to foreign language speakers, regardless of native language. So this is not kids being taught in their native language. This is getting additional support in English, right? With with perhaps some minimal support in their native language. Bilingual education is teaching both in English and the student's native language. And so this is the sort of what it looks like, right? So I am first arrival here from Mexico. I don't speak English, and there is one school that has been designated as a bilingual site. I will probably get all of my content area courses, all my math, all my sciences in Spanish, and during that process, I'll start also receiving instruction in English to learn English, right? And how is it that the State Department of Education determines that? So if in any particular year, there's one school where you may recall at the beginning, I talked about the home language surveys, right? If those surveys demonstrate that there's at least 20 kids in a particular school that speak a particular language, then the following academic year, right? So this is 2015, 2016. That survey indicated there's 20 kids at a school here in New Haven that speak Spanish. Next year, 2017, 2018, that school becomes a bilingual site school, and classes will be offered in Spanish for a group of students, okay? So they will receive bilingual education. If there's fewer than 20 students, then school only provides ESL services. There's been a recent change in the statute. It used to be that students could only get up to 30 months of ELL instruction, and last year there was a lot of activism, and now unfortunately the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission is now defunct. They were one of the victims of the budget issues in our state, but they were really instrumental in getting increased time for kids who receive English language learner support. The way it works, you get the 30 months that is indicated in the statute as of right, and then you get 10 months extensions. The way those extensions work is really the school district has to petition the State Department of Education for those additional 10 months increments. So it's not really a right that resides with the student or the parent. It's not the parent going to SDE and requesting additional 10 months. It's the school district requesting permission to have that child remain an additional 10 months. So it's a little bit sort of the fox guarding the hen house, if you think of it, right? So hopefully we don't know how that will work, but we're certainly watching the process. We're going to talk a little bit about students with special education needs. And the statute that covers special education, it's called the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA. The basics of IDEA is that schools are obligated to refer a student whose attendance, grades, or behavior are of concern to a planning and placement team meeting. This is called the Child Fine Statute. Services are up to the 21 years of age. And what is special education? It means that it's a specially designed program of instruction that is offered at no cost to the parents or guardians to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 also comes in often, particularly for kids who may experience trauma, may have some anxiety, they may not meet the criteria for special education, but they may need some accommodations for a condition that significantly impairs a major life activity, and certainly trauma qualifies as that. And so we've seen some instances where the child may not necessarily qualify for special education, but they may qualify for accommodations pursuant to Section 504. So this is where I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about strategy and some legal strategies and some advocacy strategies when trying to parse out all these issues, right? So this is a scenario. You have a young person, and I'll talk to you about a particular child that I represented, one of the things that I do at the center is I run a school-based legal clinic at Harding High School in Bridgeport. And I represented a young man who had come here from Guatemala. He was 15 when he arrived. He had not been in school since the age of 8. And he only, when he did go to school, was only sporadically because he had to work to support his family. His mom died when he was 11 years old of cancer, and he was left completely alone. He had no one in Guatemala. Eventually, after a lot of really horrendous stuff that happened to him, he made the journey up to the United States and had some acquaintances in Bridgeport, some distant relatives who agreed to, with the Office of Refugee Resettlement, to be his sponsors. And so he was resettled with them. So he had not been in school. He had experienced a lot of trauma. Among many things, he actually saw or witnessed a very delayed sort of agony of his mom dying, almost around Christmas time. His mom dying of cancer and refusing to go to sleep because she was afraid of leaving their children behind. And so that was very, very, very traumatizing, being, persecuted and not having anyone to care for his needs. When Bridgeport, try to not use the name of the school district, but when the school district received this child, enrolled him in school, it was sort of, the question came up, where do we place him? Because he had not been in school, perhaps in second grade, and when they did some testing, they figured that he could not really read or write in his native language. So he was not proficient in Spanish. He had missed some really critical stages in terms of language acquisition. He had a lot of trauma history. And the question was, can he learn? Is he, so they placed him in 9th grade, right? So they went by their chronological age. That's what they did. They said, well, you're 15, you should be in 9th grade. We can't really, we're at a loss. We can't really bring you back all the way to 6th grade even. So we're going to put you in 9th grade. When he started to struggle in school, they put him in a bilingual education class. He started to struggle significantly. He was shut down. He put his head down. He was not acting out behaviorally. He was really an introvert. And really struggling emotionally in the classroom as well. So they refer him to special education testing. And the question came up, we can't figure out if this is his inability to learn or access to curriculum is on account of interrupted learning, a language deficit, or a disability. So it's sort of that perfect storm that I described in the beginning. So a couple things that we can do as advocates for our kids is start getting sort of chronological account of their academic experiences. If they're reporting any traumatic stress, right? We want to gather as much information as we can going into a meeting with the school. Try to get school records from their countries of origin, which may be extremely difficult, right? If the school district or the receiving school district has done some language acquisition testing, get those scores. Any previously conducted evaluations, and most importantly, refer to the planning and placement team meeting. So what happens when you get to that stage, right? You're getting into the testing stage. Is that question again? What evaluation should I request? Because it's sort of what we need to figure out. What is the primary reason that this child is unable to learn? And it may be that the reason he can't learn is all three of them. It's language acquisition, it's probably a disability, and it's probably interrupted learning. And how do we differentiate and provide needs? My legal theory is that interrupted learning does not excuse the district from providing services and meeting the needs of kids if they still have the disability and they also have a language learning need, specific language learning need. And we sort of have to emphasize sort of bringing the team to the fact that, yes, he missed a lot of school, but we also have evidence here of trauma. We also have evidence here of the fact that he may have other disabilities, learning disabilities, that we need to capture. Some of the assessments, and this is sort of, and this is just a very shortened version of the strategy, and the handouts that we'll send to you have a more complete list of tests that you should be requesting. They should be, obviously, culturally, this is sort of relates to the point, they should be in their native language, and they should be culturally relevant and sensitive to their needs. So some of the tests that test, for example, the intellectual quotient will be the test of nonverbal intelligence. And so again, in the handout that I'll provide to you, you'll have more detailed information. But it's important to sort of think about that we don't just throw our hands up in the air and say we don't know what to do, which is often what districts will do, and we'll try to say, we've done everything we can't do anything else. And sort of push back on the district and say, yes, there are things that you can do. There's best practice models to meet those needs. And we'll talk about some of those in our round panel discussion. Very quickly, I'll just talk about college resources for undocumented students. Actually, Stefan and Connecticut Students for a Dream had a big role in doing this and pushing this through into 2011. And it's the ability to get in-state tuition for undocumented students who meet all of these requirements. And I know there's other legal advocacy strategies that we'll probably talk about later on. In terms of access to state and federal financial aid, the answer is for undocumented kids, it's still not viable. There was some push this year, but didn't go through. Eastern Connecticut State University has a scholarship, but it's through the Dream US organization, and the deadline was yesterday. But hopefully people knew about this and they were able to apply. Some private colleges like Wesleyan have opened up the ability for kids to get into the pool of applications. The Mexican American Legal Defense Fund puts together a great resource list every year for scholarships for kids regardless of status. So we're going to move right into healthcare, and my colleague Alice Rosenthal will be presenting.
Thanks, Edwin. That was really great. I mean, I think we can all agree that the three major areas that we all are important to all of us are our education, furthering our education, but also our physical health and our emotional health. And when all three of those aren't working or we don't have access to those, children's health in particular can really decline, and their long-term successful outcomes can be pretty poor. So I'm not going to talk for too long because there actually aren't a lot of options for access to health care for undocumented youth and families, but there are for other classifications of immigrant families, and so I'll just touch on them briefly. And then I brainstormed a little bit about some alternative and safety net programs that I'm sure a lot of you already know about, but we'll touch on those. And then we can talk, I think it sort of leads in nicely to some of the advocacy work we all need to do around services for undocumented youth, because sort of our federal policies and laws sort of ebb and flow and go up and down depending on the politics of the day, depending on the economy, depending on, sort of the sensibilities of our country. But I work on our medical legal partnership at Yale New Haven Hospital, so I work closely with a lot of the providers, and we talk often about social determinants of health and how accessing services can impact your health in so many ways. And so many of the providers I work with feel so strongly about access to preventative health care and not just emergency health care, and how that has, it's really important for youth in particular. And so it's devastating. They see a family and they're undocumented, and they can provide a certain amount of care depending on the parent's ability to pay, and then at past that, they can't, refer them to the specialist or get their extra care that they need. So really quickly, I'll just talk about sort of access to health care. The overview is that that your eligibility for you get emergency care regardless of your immigration and insurance status, but that your access to state and federal benefits depends on immigration status. I'm not going to talk about benefits in general like food stamps and cash assistance and those programs, but those are also other benefits that your immigration status will depend on whether you are eligible for. So first, refugees. I think most of you know refugees are eligible for coverage under Husky and Medicaid. Husky here in Connecticut, as long as they meet the other eligibility criteria, so they still need to meet the financial eligibility criteria for Husky and Medicaid, but refugees do get refugee medical assistance for the first 8 months in the U.S. regardless of their income. But after that 8 months, they have to either qualify for Medicaid or get onto some other health insurance. Refugees do qualify for the Affordable Care Act, which is great, so they can pay into the exchanges if their job doesn't offer them health insurance. And so there are some options for them in that sense. I just wanted to touch, I don't have a slide on it, but there are health coverages for other legal immigrants that we aren't talking about today, but I just wanted to say really quickly, in 2009 that there was a Children's Health Insurance Program Reauthorization Act, which allowed young children and pregnant women access to non-emergency Medicaid and CHIP, which is the Children's Health Insurance Program in America. And they didn't have a 5-year waiting period, so you could come and you'd have status, but you have to wait 5 years to show that you were here lawfully, and that no longer is in existence. And so, but whether you qualify for that depends on a whole host of things about what your status is. And so the Center for Medicaid and Medicare delineated in 2010 in the letter, in the guidance to all the states, what lawfully present means. And so it has this really long list that I'm not going to bore you with today, and real detail about your immigration status and about whether or not you qualify for CHIP for kids and for pregnant women. So that is an option for other families who are legal immigrants here that I just wanted to highlight really quickly. All right. So undocumented minors and their families are ineligible for most major federal funded insurance programs. And when I first started this job, I was devastated to learn that. I was like, I can't believe there's kids out there that don't have health insurance. That's crazy to me. And then I realized that getting the Affordable Care Act passed to even have people who are here was a ridiculous hurdle to cross. And so I get the politics behind it, but I think it's an advocacy point for us all to think about and talk about. When Edwin and I have a family that we've been working with where they crossed the border from Guatemala, and they both have this very severe bone disorder where they're crippled. And so but they can't access any health care here, where that they can get a lot of help here in New Haven, but they aren't able to access it because of all these programs. And I just feel like they're the model of poster child for why we should pass reform to allow undocumented youth access to health care. And then I also just found out that even though youth might be eligible for the Deferred Action in Childhood Arrivals, DACA, CMS also issued guidance in 2012 saying that they are ineligible for Medicaid under the federal law, which is really too bad. So you say, you can come and work here, but we're not going to provide you health coverage, which is kind of, I think, an oxymoron there. But they are eligible for emergency Medicaid to cover hospitalization for emergency medical treatment, and for labor and delivery. So you can walk into the emergency room, and if you have a medical condition that requires immediate medical attention to stabilize you, then you can get services that way. So oftentimes families will use the emergency department to get access to some care for their children, especially if they're really sick. But we all know that emergency care is very expensive, and it's a huge drain on the dollars of our healthcare system. And so again, I think it's also a good talking point about saying, look at all the dollars we would save if we provided preventative care or other types of free care for families, so they didn't have to use the emergency room all the time. Let's see. So then, and then the other really important thing about undocumented families is even if they can afford to pay into the exchanges under the Affordable Care Act, because of their unlawful status, they are not allowed to even pay into the system, which again, I think is a drain on our healthcare system. And access to, but you know, everybody knows that access to appropriate diagnostic treatment and regular primary care beyond emergency treatment is really critical, but is incredibly, incredibly limited. There are some alternatives, which you can call the safety net for our system. Access to pro bono or in-kind services are very limited, but there are free care programs providing no cost for hospital procedures and services at some hospitals. So the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981 said that hospitals that are recognized as disproportionate share hospitals with respect to the percentage of low-income and uninsured patients get additional payment from the federal government to support this uncompensated care. So I know I'm probably not supposed to say this on a webinar, but Yale New Haven Hospital has a free care program that they use the funds that they get from the federal government, where you have to, if you're undocumented, you have to go apply for, or you're uninsured in general, you don't have to just be undocumented. You have to prove that you went and tried to apply for health insurance, got denied, and once you have that denial, you can apply for free care up to 6 months, but that care only covers hospital services, so you can't go outside of the hospital to get other kinds of care, and even within the hospital, it only covers certain types of procedures and services within the hospital. And so our healthcare system is so complex, a lot of the specialty care that people have access to with insurance isn't provided through the hospital. And so again, Edwin and I's patient has free care, but they can't access the orthopedic services that they need for their bones because it's outside the hospital. So there are some safety nets there for the free care programs. It's not just Yale, there are other hospitals that also provide these services. Then there's sliding scale services, but again, you have to show proof of income, and often this is hard because a lot of undocumented families don't have proof of their income because they work under the table. So it's a pretty stringent rule, and it makes it hard to access those services. But one thing that my colleague Danielle and I thought about was school-based health centers are a really critical and wonderful resource for a lot of these youth because they don't question their immigration status and they are able to actually get primary care services there, which is great. Again, they can't get specialty care, but a lot of the basic preventive health care that I think is really critical to children's good health outcomes can happen at the school-based health centers. And in addition, I love school-based health centers because they provide sort of wraparound services for youth, right? They walk in the door, they have their education, they have their health, and most school-based health centers have social workers so they can get their mental health as well, all in one nice package. And they're just really nice people. And they'll do a lot of advocacy with the school for the kids. And then the last is federally qualified health centers, which I'm sure you all know. We have 2 here in the New Haven area. There's federally qualified health centers across the country, and they are provided funding from the federal government to provide care regardless of your ability to pay, your insurance status, or your immigration status. But they also have a sliding scale fee, and so you have to show your proof of income there. And I just wanted to also note here in New Haven, I'm sure you all know this, but the Fairhaven Clinic has a free clinic on Saturday mornings that's run through the Yale School of Medicine, where the medical students volunteer to see undocumented families who can't afford to even pay the sliding scale or even access services. It's mostly for adults, it's not for children, but it's a great service for them. And they also have connected with the Yale Law School to provide legal services for those families. So they do sort of a legal screen and a health screen for families. It's really great. And in my last 30 seconds, I just wanted to point out medical interpretation, because I know it's a simple thing, but your access to healthcare isn't just about whether you have insurance, but it's about whether you can communicate with your doctor. So it's one thing to say, where's the bathroom, or, how do I get to the McDonald's, or whatever it is you need to communicate, but communicating about your healthcare is really complicated, and without having an appropriate interpreter to be able to communicate between you and your doctor is really critical. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 covers that that hospitals that receive, or any kind of clinic that receives federal funding, has to have a system in place to support limited English proficient families and anyone. And so this 4-factor balancing test talks about who would actually have to do that. So not every clinic that gets federal funding and not every place would have to do that. And they don't have to provide an interpreter. It can have just bilingual staff. They can do phone lines, and they can encourage people to bring family members. So it's not required that they have, unless it's Yale New Haven Hospital, we are required to have interpreters. And we have a wonderful interpretation staff at Yale New Haven Hospital. They're not only interpreters, but advocates for a lot of the families that they work with, which is really great. So in summary, refugees eligible for almost about anything, legal immigrants, same, and undocumented, nothing. So with that, I will turn it back over to Edwin. Oh, sorry, last one. We have a really awesome guide to healthcare rights for teens that talks about all the different rules and regulations around healthcare access for youth.
So the time now is about 10 o'clock, and we started a little late, but hopefully we have about half an hour, 40 minutes if people don't mind staying a little longer, just to go over the round panel discussion. So we're going to jump right in. And our presenters did introduce themselves right at the beginning, and hopefully as people start talking, if you just want to, say your name again, just your first name so people know who's speaking as you're making comments, etc. That will be great. So we're going to start with the first question. We have about 5 questions that we want to sort of frame the discussion around. And the first question is really, what are the needs of undocumented and refugee children in New Haven with regards to education, access to health, and mental health? So I'm going to use the same example that I talked about earlier on, the 15-year-old client from Guatemala who I represented at Harding. One of the things that was very clear to me very early on, not only that he'd had a lot of education issues that he was struggling with, but also health care issues. So at one point he's actually sitting in my office and we're trying to go over some really traumatic stuff in order to prepare a petition for court so that he could remain here lawfully. And he seemed really in discomfort and in pain, and I assume it had to do with him relating the story. I mean, it's not uncommon when you're talking about trauma that obviously is going to bring forth a lot of pain, and you might want to disconnect from what's being related. It was as simple as the fact that he was experiencing some tooth pain. He was in a lot of pain, and he had not been able to sleep for days. He had not access to simple things as just Tylenol. So as Alice said, the sort of first thing that we could do is I immediately walk with him to the school-based health clinic at Harding, who happens to have great staff, very supported staff, so that he could access dental care. So I'm wondering if people can talk about their experiences or what they're seeing on the ground in terms of unmet needs, things that you see sort of prominent that are happening. And what we're doing is, as the discussion is going along, Alice will be taking some notes, and also we're typing the notes, and we will be sending them along at the end of the discussion again with the PowerPoint slides. So whoever wants to start. Okay, great.
Hello again, Caprice with the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. I just wanted to importantly put this into context so that we have recently in the news unaccompanied minors, refugees, immigrants, and undocumented immigrants coming here, specifically Connecticut, specifically New Haven is part of the conversation today. But when we look at what is happening in Central America, we can't untie it from what the U.S. policies have been. So my perspective, it's our responsibility to take care of these children, not just, doing the right thing or wanting to help poor people, quote unquote, but when you have U.S. foreign policies that have trained over 200,000 paramilitary army folks in Guatemala to not just be military, but to torture people by the U.S., written training manual written by the U.S. from the School of the Americas. These concepts come and hit the ground here in New Haven. And this didn't happen that long ago. So in 1996 was when there was a 4-signed peace accord for the Central American Free Trade Agreement that decimated jobs in the agricultural sector. So once again, the very people that were hurt by these 200,000 paramilitary folks then did not have a way to survive and feed their children. These are the children. This was less than 26 years ago, the peace accord was signed. What that did was over 200,000 people were unemployed, trained killers in 1996. And some of them still had their weapons in hand. Then you have the drug policies that have not helped Latin America and haven't changed anything, but militarized the zone even more. And you have children fleeing drug lords coming here to New Haven. All these things equate equal to a child coming here traumatized, a child coming here fleeing for their lives, or parents saying, you know, you need to go up north because we can't save you here. So that, I just wanted to put that into context. And so what we have are school teachers, healthcare providers, advocates, all wanting to help, but we don't know what to do. So, but I wanted to put it into context because what we're doing is actually trying to bring justice back into inhumane situations that people are fleeing. Thank you.
Excellent point. Anyone?
Just kind of from my perspective, so coming from a legal service program, right? So, you know, our staff is not directly addressing barriers to accessing education and health services and mental health services, but we regularly encounter those issues, right? Because our clients need, you know, we're trying to work with them, do our best to zealously advocate for whatever immigration relief we can, but how can you work with someone in front of you who, like you said, has a toothache or didn't sleep the last couple of nights because they're reliving that trauma? I mean, that gets very challenging. And then the other issue, again, from my perspective, is that permeating all of this is this ever-present fear of deportation, of being sent back to that life that they just fled, that, you know, that they chose to make, or their parents chose to have them make that horrifying journey here because somehow that would be better than home. And so the entire time they're having to go to court, you know, like children, and see a judge and encounter a government attorney who's trying to deport them without access to, in many cases, free or affordable legal counsel or even good legal counsel. And so again, just another sort of ever-present challenge that complicates all of those things.
Thank you, Alicia. Maria.
Thank you. I think, Caprice, that you're very right when you said that there are many people willing to help. There are so many wonderful organizations that are willing to help, but I think that the organizations are not properly educated. We don't know what you said. We don't know what to do oftentimes. And in addition to that, we don't have enough resources to be able to do things right. Having said that, there are many differences between how things work in cities or towns. I come from a smaller town where the Latino population is smaller. Illegal immigration is the big elephant in the room that we all know that is there, but nobody talks about. And actually that sometimes can be a good thing because it prevents the possibility of closing doors for needs, very important needs for our children. Schools, the school system has done tremendous improvements in the past few years, but as you were talking about an example in Bridgeport, you have some schools that are better than others. I do think that we lack of bilingual, bicultural staff that is willing to be able to respond to the needs of the community. no offense to non-bilingual, non-bicultural people, they have their best interest and their best intentions oftentimes, but is not the best help that our children can have. Healthcare and mental health services is terrible. I mean, we have wonderful Band-Aids, and that's the only thing that we have. We have wonderful resources, but they're just Band-Aids. When the needs are real and they call for very specific treatments, that is absolutely non-existent for our children, and that is very scary. Another thing that I think that is very important to keep in mind, and that's something that we all do and that we need to continue working towards, is create an environment where children feel welcomed. That is very powerful. And also where they feel proud of who they are and where they come from, because that is key for them to move up and to succeed.
Yeah, this is Megan from ULA. I think that you did a great job summarizing some of the issues that these young people face, getting health care. Like you said, what I see a lot is that the primary care is, you can get the primary care, but it's much harder to get the specialists and the dental care that these children need. I would just add that in terms of the needs of these children, many undocumented children are working in Connecticut, and these are often the teenagers and children who are sort of under the radar screen, who don't have lawyers, who are not connected. But I think that it's important to keep that in mind. And even some of the teenagers who are part of ULA, who have lawyers and who have support to fight their deportation case, they go to high school and then they go to work, and they really don't have time to do homework, and they have an amazing opportunity maybe to have a life that's different from other undocumented children if they win their deportation case, but they're working. So when we think about the needs of these children, we can also be thinking about labor rights, raising the minimum wage, looking at these exploitation jobs that children are working in. Another thing that came to mind when we were talking about education, here in New Haven, most of the immigrant children at ULA are from Guatemala, and many of them speak indigenous languages, or their parents speak indigenous languages as their first language, Cachiquel, Quiche, and Mam. And there's no awareness in the schools or in the broader community that we have indigenous Guatemalans here. We have some indigenous Mexicans. So I just echo this point of we need to build a greater understanding of where people are coming from, deepen those connections of the immigrants here with the cultures, that their home cultures and their home communities, and build a greater understanding of the history that people are coming from.
Those are great points. Thank you.
Hi, this is Tanya from IRIS, and touching on some of what's been said and going back to a little bit of talk about the school-based health centers, which are amazing. They do great work. They care deeply for their students. They have a form that students, families have to fill out to register, and there's a question on that form. Has your child experienced a traumatic event in the past year, death of a loved one, a move? And in the past 5 years that I've been in this work, 100% of parents answer that question no. So I think, in terms of accessing care, there are a number of barriers to speak to, and one of them certainly is a little bit of what Megan from ULA spoke of. Parents are dealing with their own trauma, and sometimes recognizing that their children are having similar struggles, and being able to reach out for care for their children when they're just trying to meet basic daily survival needs is a chore. And then there's also the stigma that's associated with mental health needs, which we see a lot of. So if the family is willing and able to reach out for care for their children, there's the additional barrier of school-based health centers which often don't have with their social worker a language line. And oftentimes, as I think other people have mentioned, there may not be culturally competent experts in the school building who can address problems that students might be having. Everybody knows sometimes trauma can manifest as bad behavior in kids. So kids who might be acting out during the school day might be receiving inappropriate disciplinary actions rather than being pulled aside and being spoken to about mental health needs they might be facing. Thanks.
Caprice with the Community Foundation. I also wanted to go back to education. Oftentimes, having a student showing that they are ELL or having trauma or that they're a recent immigrant are all reasons as to why traditional school systems say we can't teach them. We'll do the best we can. And one of the responses in one of the school districts, the Boston Public School District, advocates, including myself, said no. There are other places that they know how to reframe, restructure a high school even to help students perform well. And so a group of us went and visited a school in New York and another area, and then we developed the Boston International High School. And one of the key components was not saying to a recent immigrant, you need to learn English, acquire mastery of all these other subject matters, and pass the high-stakes standardized test in 4 years. We pushed to get it to 5-year high school. And you do not age out. So when you hit 18, you still have access to that education. The very first 3 years of the school, the students outperformed a good number of the regular public schools, high school students, outperformed in math and in other areas. With the right support system, it can happen. So it's a matter of, will a school district, will a state Board of Education have the will to want to create a structure that truly supports the needs of these students?
This is Kim Daly from Clifford Beers and the Trauma Coalition. I really appreciate just all the thoughts in the room, and certainly regarding our school-based health clinics, which we're a part of. For us, the Trauma Coalition is really relying on our community to provide support for children that is not based on, insurance requirements or being part of, programs that require a monetary funding, but really bringing supports for all kids that don't require that. And, in regards to trauma, it's really about not just, so you're here and you've come from somewhere, but also what was the journey that brought you here. And so we really are trying to make schools, trauma informed, but then also culturally informed. So not just, what happened when you were there and in the country that you came from, but what was your journey here and what has been told to you since you have come here. And the amount of loss that occurs in each of those stages and those phases of coming to the country is just immense. And so really making teachers, our security officers in our schools, our principals, anybody who really has access to our children and families, communicating the same message around, given the losses that you've been through, there is support, and we are going to find that for you. We really try and pair our mental health support with basic needs support. If we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people cannot access higher level, support if they don't even have food, if they don't have a bed to sleep on, if they don't have, somebody helping them translate their needs in a way that is supportive to them. So we really take a look at what is the need of the family. Can we help them? Can we look at public health support to really communicate and destigmatize, trauma treatment and basic needs support, saying, we are all in need and how can we help each other? So that's just a few things that we're trying to do.
If I can, so this is Alicia, again from the International Institute. Kimberly, you talked about the journey coming over, and I think that's so important. We have an unaccompanied, as I stated before, an unaccompanied minor program at our organization, but we also have a partially federally funded anti-trafficking program, and so as a result, all of our attorneys, when they do screenings, especially with vulnerable populations like unaccompanied minors, are screening for trafficking. And Daniela knows this. I mean, we see really grossly disproportionate amount of trafficking victims among unaccompanied minors. Victims of trafficking either in their home country, and it led to part of their reason of why they came here. An extremely high number of individuals trafficked en route to the U.S., forced to carry drugs in, forced to work in stash houses, performing commercial sexual acts, cooking, cleaning, and doing a variety of other tasks, but also once they've gotten here in the U.S., because sometimes the sponsor who's available is not the sponsor that anyone would really want, and isn't a family member, has pretended to be a family member, is next of kin, the next cousin, but isn't the guy or gal who should be with that child. And so it's terribly frightening. The risk level is extremely high, and so you talked about the numbers of enrollment versus the numbers of children, and so that 90% sounds great, but what about the 10%, right? What about those 1,000 children who are, for all intents and purposes, missing, right? Missing with people who may or may not be doing the best they can to provide for them, not speaking English, not knowing how to ask for or receive appropriate help, probably wouldn't even if they could, because they're coming from a place where law enforcement doesn't help. They're the ones committing the crime or are often complicit with the commission of crimes. And so just again, another factor to consider, that these youth are at such high risk to all sorts of exploitation, but especially trafficking, and including those who, many of my clients who are 16 and 17 are being told as they try to enroll in school that they can only go to the night school, that they don't have enough English, that's the only option, and they don't know to fight that. And so they do, and then they start working during the day, and they're working hard-working, low-paying jobs. Not that that means you are a victim of trafficking, but if you're in that kind of position where you're working to live and you're working long hours and a hard job, you are vulnerable to exploitation, and that exploitation can and often does rise to the level of trafficking.
Those are great points. So I have one more from Daniela. You want to?
Hi, so this is Daniela. I have the great pleasure to work for two nonprofits where, Edwin and Alice are my colleagues at CCA and Alicia is my colleague at ICON. At ICON, I'm a caseworker for undocumented minors, so I'm tasked with receiving the referrals from ORR and then making home visits to make sure that these sponsors and the minors are getting along and helping them locate services in the community, clinics, what schools they should enroll in. And one of my biggest hardships is that what I think is a gross oversight on ORR's part is that these sponsors have to meet with me on a voluntary basis. And my job is to do 3 visits to the home. And at any time, a sponsor can call me and say, stop coming to my house. Don't visit me. We don't want to see you. And it's happened so many times where sometimes if they say, the sponsors themselves are undocumented, they're like, I work. I can't just take time out of my day. I get home at 6 o'clock. So unless you want to come visit me at 6 o'clock, don't come to my house. Or other times I'll do 1 visit and I'll notice something's off. And then when I try to schedule a second visit, the sponsor's like, yeah, no, I don't want you to come to my house. And there's nothing that I can do because their sponsorship is voluntary. So there's nothing in that contract when ORR releases these minors to these sponsors that say you have to you have to comply with these number of visits. So after the first visit or before we even get into the door the first time, these sponsors can tell me, don't come to my house, don't call me, and I can't do anything about it. And so, it puts me as a community worker who's trying to support this minor, and then I'm left thinking, okay, now do I have a possible case of abuse? Is something going on? Like, what's really going on with this minor behind these closed doors? And that's just something I wanted to touch up on because it makes it hard for me to then do my job, right? To connect the minor and the sponsor with the services that they need. And oftentimes these sponsors work really hard, and some are really great, and often it's a mom or dad, but then you get one where it's a 19-year-old cousin who like doesn't know where to take the minor to a clinic, and then it makes it really hard as a community provider to offer these support services. And so I just wanted to touch on that because I think it's a really gross oversight on behalf of ORR, especially like Alicia said, they are minors who are being literally released into the hands of traffickers and people who will exploit them and abuse them. And it makes it really hard for a community provider such as myself to go out and then try to see which minors are the ones that are the most vulnerable. So I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
I'm going to address that very briefly. I think that you bring up a really important point, and I just want to remind people, obviously, that if, depending on your role, you may be a mandated reporter under state law, and you may have to report to the Department of Children and Families. That is quite sort of a challenging situation because if, in fact, you're reporting a family that it is the only resource for this child, and there's nothing really going on except that they are working. In fact, they're way too stretched out, then you're jeopardizing that placement. So it's a tough call, and I appreciate that. There's been a lot of great ideas that have been put forth already, so we're going to move right to the next question. So the next question is, I guess, what are some of the challenges in meeting those needs? And are there any gaps in accessing services? And I think we've, in large part, addressed that question. I think we got right into the discussion. Does anyone want to sort of talk additional point that you want to make regarding that point?
Well, whether it's an undocumented minor or undocumented adult, we also have the issue with notaries that are scamming our community and charging outrageous amounts, promising people that they will change their immigration status for them, and then they get deported. And we're talking about $2,000 out of someone who makes every dollar delivering sandwiches and saves, for forever to be able to pay those $2,000, and then they get deported. So that's happening in New Haven, and I met someone like that in the elevator who paid $2,000. In Connecticut, we just, with the support of International Institute of Connecticut and Alicia, thank you so much for making it happen, we did a Board of Immigration Appeals training to increase the number of BIA representatives who are certified, who will be accredited to be able to provide these types of services, and they need to be working with an institution that is recognized by the Board of Immigration Appeals, and Spanish Community of Wallingford is going through that process now to become an additional resource along with the International Institute of Connecticut and Junta. So we ask people to become informed where these Board of Immigration Appeals accredited folks, including Unidad Latina en Acción, actually have volunteers who are immigrants themselves who are going through the Board of Immigration Appeals training certification. Hopefully we'll get 15 more that pass the exam this week. And so there are resources out there. We're very aware of the scam artists that are out there, and we encourage people to look at the various community foundation websites that are part of the collaborative. We will have listings of where people can go and not get scammed for support for immigration status questions.
Thank you, Caprice. Maria?
I do have to say that some of the challenges oftentimes is also our own community. I do understand that our community face too many challenges. They need to work. They need to provide for their families. But it is very important that we have candid conversations with our community to understand the importance of them learning English. They're getting educated about all of these issues, particularly the one in immigration. Oftentimes, they go and they talk with an attorney that tell them you do not have a case, so they go and talk until they find the person that will tell them that they do have a case. So it is important that sometimes there are difficult conversations to have, and sometimes it is difficult, but we need to really push our community to open their eyes and to educate themselves and to prevent all of these scams and to put themselves in a better situation.
And in line with that, helping them recognize they're not alone, and with people power coming together, there are opportunities to change things, including challenging a school that refuses to provide services, but talking amongst others who are going through the same thing and coming together as a collective, not as individuals solely, because then it's easy for a system to say no. And so I think the hope for a lot of these issues, the heart of it is really our organizing, mobilizing groups that are here at the table as well, such as Unidad Latina Acción, Connecticut Students for a Dream, and others who are saying we can't stand by and let this continue in the way it is because it's hurting a lot of families, hurting a lot of children. And we're not just talking undocumented, we're talking about including mixed status families where you may have children who are U.S. born who are not accessing these healthcare systems that they have the right to because the parents are undocumented. Or you might have one parent who's undocumented, the other one who is documented, and currently in the state of Connecticut, probation, foster care, etc., they do not have full awareness of what immigration laws are. And I've spoken to an officer who stated the mother's the one who's abusing the children, and I've worked on this case for a family here in New Haven even for 10 years. And I don't know how to help them because I don't know the immigration implications. And the dad is afraid that if he gets deported, what will happen to his kids? And the mother threatens him with deportation. So here you have a whole other system in Connecticut and well-intended workers for the state, but not knowing the ins and outs of immigration and how to advocate. So the dad could actually qualify for U visa. He is physically abused by the mother, and that would support him. And so she was one of the individuals that came through our training, the Board of Immigration Appeals, and we'll use that knowledge now to protect children. But I think also for other individuals who do work with these families to become aware of what immigration law entails, or find resources where they can go to and find information, because it is hurting families, this broken immigration system.
Thank you, Caprice. Yeah.
This is Alicia again, and I have to leave in a minute, so I just wanted to say one thing, and then you triggered a thought, which is that case and in general, right, being told I'm going to deport you and keep your U.S. citizen children, that is abuse, right? You don't need the physical part. That's sufficient, right? That's coercion. That's threatening. That is sufficient. So yeah, physical abuse can get you there, but you don't need it, right? It's another form of domestic violence that could qualify you for immigration relief, like a U visa. But one last point I wanted to bring up, like increasing the amount of BIA accredited representatives in Connecticut is phenomenal. Increasing the capacity of organizations like ourselves and other to do work. To do legal immigration work is so vital, but also we need to do a better job of tapping into private attorneys and law firms and pro bono attorneys in Connecticut, because like even an organization like ourselves that's been around for decades and doing this work, and we charge fees that we try to cover most of the service costs because it's hard to get outside funding for undocumented immigrants. It's just a fact. Even with that, we don't have the resources to do nearly enough. And in most cases, these removal cases are long, they're costly, they're among the most resource intensive, and you know, individual nonprofit organizations and BIA reps and attorneys at those organizations can only take a few, right? We can only take a handful a year. Same thing, like, you know, the Yale Clinic does a wonderful job, but same thing, they can only take a handful a year, and we're talking about, you know, many more than a handful every single day, need legal assistance. And so and there are lots of private attorneys and small firms and large firms, especially in New Haven, who do a tremendous amount of pro bono work. But I think we have to find more ways to leverage that, to be more creative, especially tapping into young and vibrant and motivated new attorneys without immigration experience who would be willing, and it would be beneficial to their future careers to learn more about immigration and hopefully use some of their time to help support this population. Thanks.
That's a great point. I echo that point. We at the center, we started a pro bono project regards to kids who are abused, abandoned, or neglected who qualify for special immigrant juvenile status. And we had about 42 attorneys that attended the training here in New Haven and have served kids from New Haven, but also Fairfield County and other parts of the state. And we will begin another pilot program in Hartford and east of the river. So that will be something that we're looking to expand. So any last comments, questions, or should we move ahead? Okay, great. I think we've covered a lot of big ideas so far as well, but I'm wondering if there's any other people want to add in terms of big ideas, right? And okay.
So just talking about, big ideas to address what immigrant children are facing in Connecticut. A big idea at ULA is not one more deportation, and we stand for stopping all deportations, and that includes people who qualify for certain forms of relief and people who do not qualify. And we also stand for stopping the raids. And one thing that I would like to see us mobilizing around more in Connecticut, or starting to mobilize around, is raising the cap on visas for special immigrant juveniles. There's a limited number of visas that are given out to abandoned and abused immigrant children. The cap has been reached for Central American children. They're just not giving out more of those visas this year, right, Edwin? I'm not a lawyer, but this is what my colleagues at Esperanza Law Center are talking about. And so we want to make some noise about this with our congresspeople, with our senators, about how there are many more abandoned and abused immigrant children than there are visas available. And what's happening is that because these visas are no longer available, many of these juveniles, the immigration court is reopening their cases, and if the young people are not in contact with their lawyer, or they haven't submitted their change of address form, they're going to get a deportation order in absentia, not showing up to court. And we're seeing the Obama administration, aggressively raiding homes and communities to deport these children, and moms mostly, who, for whatever reason, they haven't gotten a lawyer, they haven't showed up to court, because they've fallen through the cracks, because they haven't gotten access to those services. So, there's a movement in Connecticut to stop these raids. There's a movement to say not one more deportation. But I really think that we can start making some noise about how there are, we need to get more of these visas available to children. Other things that we do to empower this community is, at ULA we have, we try to pair each immigrant child with a volunteer, or sometimes with a church, who would support that child or that family, and that's something that IRIS does too, and that we sort of learned from IRIS, because we don't have social workers or official social services for these families, but there are volunteers and there are congregations that can be paired up with these folks and take them to the health centers. We even
take people to court, and that is actually really important so that they don't feel alone, so that when they're going to court, they feel supported. They have people in the courtroom who kind of have their backs. And that has worked very well. And then the other thing we do at ULA is that we have a community meeting every Monday. And so our families come together and they share ideas with each other. And that is hugely important because often undocumented immigrants know a lot more about where to get healthcare services than I do because they find ways. And then they share knowledge with each other and they build knowledge with each other. And someone says, oh, I went to this health center and I couldn't get services. And somebody else says, oh, you should try that dentist. You should try that health center. This is what I did. I'll take you. And so we build that power collectively, like Caprice was saying. And the other big idea or strategy that I would share is telling our stories in a public way. So these immigrant children have met with Governor Malloy when he didn't want more immigrant children coming to Connecticut. They had a meeting with him. Some of these immigrant children have, rallied with Mayor Harp and our police chief to say stop the raids. They have spoken with journalists and told a bit of their stories, whatever part of their stories they're willing to share. And the more that we can get these stories told, the more we can create an environment in Connecticut that's more welcoming to them. These young people who have the bone disease, who can't get health care, that's a story that can be told. And there are certain journalists who are more sympathetic to these causes who can tell the story in a way that really mobilizes people. There are many doctors who would probably be willing to donate their services, or people who would be willing to get mobilized if we can get these stories out into the media and into the public sphere.
Those are great, awesome ideas. I want to address something very quickly about the special immigrant juvenile status visa. You're absolutely correct, right? The number of visas has been met for the first time in history. Historically, there's the U.S. government since 1990, when special immigrant juvenile status became available, has been providing 10,000 visas per year. In fiscal year, I think 2014, the number of visas that was granted was about hovering around 7,000 or so. And this year, for the first time before the end of the fiscal year, that number was met, that cap was met for 10,000. And it impacts particularly 3 countries in Central America, one of them being Guatemala. And so what is being said is there's a lot of uncertainty regarding what is the best strategy to protect kids who may have gone through the first process of getting the visa protection, which is going through the state court and getting the findings that are necessary to apply for the benefit. And then what happens if you don't get the visa and you're still in that status? There's still some work that needs to happen to figure that out in the meantime. But the idea of asking our government to increase that number because of the humanitarian crisis is absolutely necessary. That's something that we should all rally around. So, Estefan, you wanted to touch?
Thank you. This is Stefan from Connecticut Students for a Dream. I'm not going to speak for a little bit because Megan actually mentioned a lot of what I was going to say in being, I think, kind of the grassroots group representation at the table about kind of like a way that we're going to solve a lot of these big issues, kind of like labor rights, education for undocumented youth, is the power from the community. And I think that what Connecticut Students for a Dream has done has shown that. I think that when kind of the Trust Act passed that allowed for some protections and police not cooperating with ICE, that happened because undocumented folks went to the Capitol and told their stories at public hearings. The driver's licenses that passed for undocumented folks, 1,000 people showed up at a public hearing then. For in-state tuition for undocumented folks, 50 students told their stories, and legislators told us that was the first time we've actually heard or seen someone undocumented. That's probably not true, let's be honest, but that is kind of like the kind of like running mentality and things and how folks describe this. So I think that is like one of the biggest ways we're going to deal with some of these big issues is kind of like hearing from the community and providing those pathways to leadership. Because I don't think also we can expect folks to just kind of come out of the woodwork right away, right? There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of fear. So the question also is being proactive. We do a lot of work with schools through the College Access Program. And one of the things we do is saying, you know, I do a lot of like hour trainings, which is a great start, but we're also looking at our national organization, United We Dream, has like a 4-hour training model where you really go deep into what is the trauma, what is the mental health needs, what is the history of immigration in our country? Because I think without that understanding, you can provide services. And what I see in schools, I go into a lot of schools that have a decent amount of services, but if the understanding is not there, students will still feel that they are not welcome and they're not accepted, because true welcoming is kind of like, what does the curriculum of a school look like? I remember when I was taught about immigration, I didn't learn anything about kind of the immigration policies that Connecticut Institute for a Dream has taught me. So I think it's really looking at, if we want people to access services, if we want schools to be welcoming, we need staff and we need everyone to have a deep understanding, being proactive, and then providing those pathways for the actual community and undocumented folks to then take the reins in leadership and say, these are the needs of our community, these are how we're going to fight for them, and these are what some of the options are. So I really hope that folks will, you know, connect with groups and local folks in the community. And there's a lot of great resources represented around the table, but I think it's that really deep connection and that voice, and then figuring out together how do we work on these things is really going to push some of these ideas forward.
Thank you, Stefan.
Hi, this is Tanya from IRIS again. 3 things I just wanted to mention super quick. At IRIS, we have a refugee leader group that we've developed over the past maybe year and a half, and it's a group of refugees who represent every country from which refugees have joined us, and both genders. And they're responsible for every step of the process in helping refugees from the day they arrive. We have a representative from their culture meet them at the train station or the airport, and they also may be involved in cooking the welcome meal. They exchange contact information, and this refugee leader is a touchstone for this person from the day they arrive as long as they need. And it's so important to have their support, because they've been through it. They know the process. They know what obstacles clients might encounter as they're going along on their journey. So that's a big idea that's really working out well for us. And we're actually in the process of developing a refugee youth leadership group who can offer the same kind of support for kids. Another thing I just wanted to say, maybe to echo what's already been said, is that I think we need to make more of a push to find pro bono support, because I know, as already has been said again, I'm calling Alice every day, almost every day, a couple times a week. And of course, Alice and everybody else, ICON, who does fantastic work and who we refer so many clients to. We have an immigration attorney who, you know, she can only do so much. There's only so much that can be done with the support that we have. So we need to make more of a push to find people who are just entering the field, pro bono support. Yeah, and also I just wanted to throw out there BRICS.org. It's Bridging Refugee, Youth, and Children's Services. I think that's it. But it's a great site for all things related to refugee youth, not just refugees, but immigrants, all kinds of immigrants. It's a great clearinghouse for information if you're looking for best practices, things, big ideas that other people are doing. I'm on their site every week, at least a few times, just looking for ideas, especially if I'm struggling with something, just to see what other people are doing. Thanks.
And I do want to mention CIRA. Connecticut has an immigrant rights coalition that's statewide, and many of the people around the table are also part of their founding members. Thank you, Megan, for being one of the founding members of CIRA. And Stefan, and CIRA is trying to bring about, you know, collective power for change, for policy change, policy reform. And so encouraging people who are part of this webinar to engage with a local immigrant rights group and explore joining CIRA to increase that collective power. There's also trainings that are going on. There's one coming up on Saturday, June 18th, to become more informed around DACA, DAPA, if the extension should see the light of day, to be well informed on that as well. And the training is actually on how to facilitate a DACA, DAPA clinic, checking eligibility requirements, supporting people through that. But more importantly, I would say there's a component on know your rights, regardless of your immigration status. What are your rights if I should approach you, etc. And then more importantly than that is trying to welcome people to be part of a mobilized effort to continue fighting for immigrant rights. As long as the immigration system is broken, we have to continue that fight, and it's with people power. So I would encourage in all those fronts to get engaged. And then I do want to mention the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. We're fortunate to also support other groups that are doing work in this area. Apostle Immigrant Services is one, for example. And when I think of Sister Mary Ellen, I also think of the work that she does and how individuals from the state call her when they have cases and they don't have someone currently at the state who is an immigration attorney full-time, and that is not meeting the Constitution here in Connecticut. So that's another area that advocacy can support. I would also like to mention if people don't have time but they have money, to donate to some of the groups around this table who are doing great work, including others like Elm City International. They support literacy achievement for students, primarily immigrant and refugee students, through soccer as well. And they have a strong college access going rate as well as retention rate graduating from college. So they have a really unique, beautiful model. And New Haven Legal Assistance is another group that we work with. And Planned Parenthood, when we talk about access to free healthcare, Planned Parenthood in New Haven is one of the few free resources, but primarily around reproductive health. Oh, it's not free? Ah, that's good to know.
Thank you, Caprice. The great points. And Natalia, you wanted to.
Hello, everyone. I'm Natalia Xiomara Kiefo. I was on the board of directors for CCA, and awesome organization, work with Edwin, Alice. And I'm not a nonprofit, but Employment Resource Team, I do partner with a lot of nonprofits. I used to be with Junta. That's how I know. I remember you from when I was the Employment and Economic Development Director at Junta, and I remember you, Caprice. But I just want to say, you had mentioned, your name is Tanya, that even though I'm a for-profit Employment Resource Team, I do trainings that I can assist with any type of workforce development training, because one of my clients is Housing Authority of New Haven. So I work with them with their, even though they don't have undocumented, we may have one or two, but the percentages, yeah, sure. So definitely reach out to me if you're ever interested in bringing a group or having me come to your organization, and we could just sit down and talk and put together some sort of training for your clients, and it will be free of charge. So that's the pro bono when you mentioned that I can offer. Okay.
Thank you, Natalia. And thanks to Natalia, we're actually hosting here the panel discussion. So she offered her space. So it was very nice of her. Okay, so I think we have one last question, and then we'll sort of end our webinar this morning. I think around the table we've talked about a lot of opportunities to collaborate and share the work that we are all doing and support one another. But I just want to sort of, in parting remarks, if people want to add anything else with regards to that, very important point.
Yeah, so this is Stefan again from Connecticut Students for a Dream. Just in wrapping up, we are a statewide organization, so we do have kind of like regional teams around the state in Hartford, New Haven, Danbury, the Bridgeport Southwest area, Willimantic. So if folks are working with undocumented youth in those areas, please feel free to reach out to us and get them connected to like I think one of the big things we talked about is building community, and there are a lot of undocumented youth in Connecticut Students for a Dream who are currently in college, working, facing all these challenges, but also knowing where some of the resources are. So it's a great way to connect. Also, our website, www.ct4dream.org, hosts its own scholarship list for scholarships for undocumented students, as well as information about how to reach out for trainings, for school staff, for colleges. So please, on the education front, feel free to reach out and use that website as well.
Great. So I just learned something today as well. Thank you. I appreciate it. Anyone else wants to add a couple?
Just to echo what Caprice said about CIRA, that stands for Connecticut Immigrant Rights Alliance, and that was created to bring all of us together. That's a space where any organization that serves immigrants or advocates for immigrants in the state can come together to build our power and to advocate if we need to go to the legislature or to go to the governor of Connecticut or support each other. If there's something great that's happening in New Haven that we want to replicate in Wallingford, CIRA is the place where we can all come together. And you can email immigrationct@Google Groups to join the listserv. And the meetings happen once a month, and we try to have the meetings in a different part of the state each month. I think it's really important for us to get out of the major cities, and get around the state and reach folks who are, especially challenged working in Fairfield County or Wallingford or places that have less power, less of a critical mass. But that's a really great place if you're not connected to get connected with all of us and to bring your ideas about how we can work together.
Thank you, Megan.
I know being on the ground and mental health workers, social workers, people like that sometimes really don't know the questions to ask or the ones that are most important to families. So certainly to connect with all the resources you guys have said, find the right people who can help you in terms of any language barriers or just knowledge gaps that you have. The American Psychiatric Association through the DSM-5 really provides you with the cultural formulation interview. That is actually just going to give you your list of questions that you can talk to families about, and it provides a lot of supplemental modules. One really is highlighted at section 11 that is for immigrants and refugees. It guides you through specific questions, pre-migration, post-migration, who are you living with now, are you worried about family in your country of origin, and really gives you step-by-step. I would recommend, if you're going to ask the questions, though, make sure you know who to connect them with if you then have a question that is answered, saying I am having issues with immigration or I need support for documentation and things like that. You can provide that resource right away when they answer that question. So that can just help providers guide your questions.
And then I will say this, that I myself was an undocumented child that grew up in New Haven, came around the age of 5 from Guatemala, and I had the opportunity to come back into my community and to continue giving back to my community, and I've been doing this work for over 20 years now. And all of that has only been possible, a large part because of amnesty. My family, we were able to take up the opportunity in the 80s related to the amnesty bill that a Republican president passed. And so when we continue pushing forward for immigrant rights, do it all the way, anything less will only continue causing pain and split families and cause trauma and fear. And I don't think that's what we want as a country. And so we want people who are healthy, happy, and can thrive and continue giving back to one another. And so just wanted to say that.
Thank you for sharing. That's great. Parting remarks. Anyone else wants to say anything else? So I just want to say we went way over our time because this is a really great discussion, and we won't do a recap, but you will. get the salient points of our discussion. We will send those to you in an email with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. These are really great ideas. I think it's a follow-up. It will be interesting to see if we could continue to have conversations. And I know there's different groups. We're all having conversations, but to be motivated to join the discussion, and as Megan and Caprice has, mentioned, Zira, right? Join groups like Zira or follow Connecticut Students for a Dream, right? All of our colleagues who are doing work here, make sure that you are keep up on what the work that they're doing, the great work that they're doing. So just want to thank our panelists for a wonderful, for being really generous with your time, and for the really insightful and thorough and really thought out the discussion. Really appreciated. We're going to end our webinar now. As I said, there's going to be some information on specific resources, and I'll probably be adding more now that we had the discussion. We're going to be looking at some of the great resources that were shared here today. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us, and again, thank our panelists for being here this morning.